Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm Coach, mother of four, and potty talker, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where I confess something from my own parenting and coaching life, teach a lesson around it, and answer your questions. Even we parenting experts are far from perfect, and the real magic happens when we get down with all that imperfection. We get into the gritty side of parenting here, so earbud up and dive in.
Welcome into the podcast, everybody. I'm excited to be here with you again this week. And if my calculations are correct, this episode should be going out on New Year's Day. So the first thing I want to say is happy New Year to everybody that's listening. I am so honored to be just a part of your world. And I'm sending you all of the best wishes for a new year full of growth and fulfillment and everything that you are looking for. And I think that our topic today is going to be so well aligned with the new year because it's that time of year when people are setting resolutions for themselves. And as parents, I think one of the biggest resolutions that we set is getting on top of it with our parenting. And I think a subset of that resolution that is super common is like finally, not yelling, not using my temper anymore. And in fact, you see a ton of parenting experts advertising like different tools to help you be successful in a commitment to a no yell January. Or have you heard this idea of like a no yell January? I wrote a couple of blog posts and sent emails about no yell January out, over the years. It seems like every January I'm like, watching all of these posts about no yell January makes me want to yell. But it all comes down to this idea that we don't want to be losing our temper with our kids. We know it's not the best way to be effective in our parenting. And also, we know that it's like harmful to our kids. We know that, we don't like being yelled at. If any of us were raised by authoritarian parents, we are probably plagued by the idea that we might be turning into our parents whenever we do lose our temper, all of that stuff. And so we come to this like place where we're just like, I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm just going to be neutral. I'm going to be calm, no matter what my kids do. I'm just going to be cool, calm, and collected. I'm not going to lose my temper anymore. Well, hopefully this podcast episode will do a couple of things. Like, first of all, I hope that it will help you relax around setting that rigid rule for yourself, help you understand why our efforts at always being calm are totally futile. And then also hopefully inspire you that just because we can't actually fulfill a commitment to never yelling or never being angry, that doesn't mean that we can't completely up level and change our parenting game. You absolutely can do that. So my ultimate goal always when I'm talking to you in the podcast or in my emails or my blog or whatever is to leave you with this feeling of inspiration, hope, enthusiasm. The Spanish word ganas is always like prominent in my mind. It's just like this inner drive or power, energy, motivation to really go for something. So that's what I'm hoping you're going to experience today while I am talking about this idea of anger and the no yell January pipe dream. And of course, as always, we're going to start with a confession from me. And it is easy for me to have a confession for you about anger because I am an Ania type 1, which means that anger is a huge part of who I am. Obviously, all 9 types experience anger because it's an emotion that we all have access to and that's we feel sometimes. But the types that are in the doing triad, the gut triad, the body triad, sometimes it's called the intuition triad. The 3 types that fall into that triad are core, underlying emotion is anger. So we experience anger in a very like deep, profound, intimate way that is even more than the other types. And just to refresh your memory, the three types that fall into that triad are the type 8, which is sometimes called the challenger, the type 9, which is sometimes called the peacemaker, and the type 1, which is what I am, which is sometimes called the reformer. And in each of these three types relate to that anger differently. So an 8 will externalize their anger, a 9 will repress their anger, and a 1 will internalize their anger. But regardless of how we interact with our anger, we feel it big time. So it is very easy for me to have lots of things to confess to you, because not only do I feel a lot of anger and it's a big part of who I am, but I also feel a lot of shame around my anger, which means that it feels like something I need to confess. So, my confession for you, I actually have two confessions for you. I'm going to give you a confession that's just a demonstration of my anger, a true thing that happened to me, or that I did, I have to own. And then I have a confession to you about how I relate to my anger. So, my first confession for you, just to demonstrate that I'm not just making this up, that I really have a lot of rage inside of me, even though I have worked my entire life not to show up in the world this way. I still am quite a rageful person as a one. Um, this is from a very long time ago. It is a very true story. But when I was let's see, when my kids were let's see, maybe two and maybe not even two, like about 1 year old. And so that would make my oldest 3 years old. And I didn't have any other kids. So I just had a 3 year old and a 1 year old. And we were working on selling our house because we were going to move. And so, you know how it is when you're selling your house. You have to keep the house clean. We happened to have people coming over to see the house. And I had like gotten all my ducks in a row. I had cleaned the house. I'd gotten the kids loaded up into the car. I had got us all packed up for like, whatever excursion it was at the time. I can't remember. Probably, if I had to guess, it was the Children's Museum, because I spent a lot of time at the Children's Museum in those years. Had us all squared away. It was time for us to leave. The people who were visiting the house were going to be there in like 15 minutes or something. And I couldn't find my keys. And I think the process of getting us all ready to go and the stress of getting the house clean had just been building up and building up. And I completely lost my mind as I was like looking more and more and more for my keys. And I somehow in my head blamed my husband, who was not home. He was out at work. And I couldn't find my keys. I was convinced that Mike had taken them or moved them or something like that. I I called him and he didn't answer, which just enraged me even more. I called him like several times and he didn't answer. I by that time was like screaming while I was like walking and running through the house looking for my keys. I finally called Mike's secretary, because he had a secretary at the time. And I was like, this is an emergency. And I was furious. I was like, can you just tell Mike that he needs to answer the freaking phone when his wife calls him? And I'm sick of being like the last thing that he cares about and blah, blah, blah. You can see how I was like really going off to the races. This was not about my keys anymore. It was about the fact that every time I called Mike, it went straight to his voicemail. I was his last priority. He never answered his phone for me. He never called me back, blah, 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 blah. I was so upset that I literally like ranted about it to his secretary. She went and pulled him out of the meeting that he was in. And I just was like losing my mind at him, just like screaming at him about where my keys were. He had no idea where they were, because it actually wasn't him who had moved my keys or anything like that. I finally, like, as a last resort, looked into like the kitchen junk drawer, because sometimes, you put all keys in there or whatever. It wasn't in there. And I literally, like, my brain just broke. And after I had completely made a fool of myself in front of, like, to my husband's secretary and then to my husband, then I was so mad, I just started screaming at the top of my lungs, not even words. I was just going, screaming and slamming that junk drawer so hard over and over and over again that the entire face of the drawer finally broke off in my hand. And when I saw it, I like enraged me even more. I completely lost my mind. I threw it across the floor, across the kitchen, and it, like a corner of it, hit the linoleum floor of our kitchen and put this big gouge mark in it. So now these people that are coming to look at our house are going to see this broken drawer and the big gouge in the linoleum floor that I just put into it. And I completely lost my mind. And um it is one of the most like humiliating things that I've ever done. Like I was so ashamed of myself. Nobody actually saw me do this, by the way. My kids were in the car in the garage, so thank goodness they didn't even hear me, let alone see me doing what I was doing. And I was home alone, but it still was so mortifying. I was so ashamed of myself, not just for how I behave, but for being the kind of person who could behave that way. It was a horrible, horrible experience for me. And I still, all these years later, feel like it's one of my worst moments as a human being. And that confession leads me to that second confession about my relationship with anger. And this is really typical for Ania type ones, but lots of people feel this way towards anger. Live in a society that really shuns anger. We don't um, see it as normal or healthy. We might say, like, oh, everyone feels angry sometimes. And, of course, sometimes you feel angry, or, you know, oh, of course that situation made you angry, or, all of those things. But there's a difference between actually being angry, like showing anger, behaving angrily, and our sort of lip service that we pay to the existence of anger. Like, yeah, sure. We all know that anger exists, but it's really, if you were even in the self help world, there's almost this underlying idea that if you were as evolved as you're supposed to be, if you had been doing your work, if you didn't have all of these, you know, uh, erroneous stories and thoughts about the world around you and your false interpretations about the world around you, you wouldn't feel anger. So if you do feel anger, it's really just a sign that you're not really seeing the world the way you're supposed to. And there's something the matter with you, or you're not finished, or you haven't done enough work yet, or you haven't evolved enough yet, or whatever. And that is absolutely how I have always looked at anger. That, a truly evolved person would never behave that way. And not only would they not behave that way, they just simply wouldn't feel angry. So even in situations where I might feel angry, but I don't behave in this, absolutely insane way, um, I still feel very disappointed in myself um, for for not being evolved enough. Like every time that I feel angry, it's that anger is just a reminder that I am still messed up. And and for an Enia type one, that's a really common way to relate to anger. We often have a lot of rules about forbidding anger in ourselves. And because our focus is so much on improving ourselves, becoming the best version of ourselves, being better than we are now, you know, um, and improving the world around us, a constant reminder of how not better we are, it's quite painful. And so, what I want to talk to you about today is how to look at anger in a healthier way. So, and I think that by the time I'm done, you're going to completely give up this idea of a no yell January. Because the idea of no yell January is like this idea, just like what I've just been describing about what happens for me internally around anger, which is like, this is forbidden. Now you're committed. You can't do it. It's against the rules. You just make a rule about it and then you won't do it anymore. And now every time that you do, break that rule, whether either it's because you feel angry or because you act angrily, you're just reminding yourself of how bad you are. Like you just didn't do it. And there's so much out in the zeitgeist about anger, and even like the language in like self-help books. Like if you decide that you want to figure out how to deal with your anger, all the language you're going to see is about things like control your anger, let go of anger, release anger, eradicate anger. This idea of like anger is bad and it's this mark of an unevolved person. We really should not be angry. You don't see things like, eradicate any other emotion that exists, right? Like, eradicate sadness. Well, no, sometimes we can feel sad. And I wish that we had that same feeling around anger, but instead we feel like we should not be angry. And that if we were really living the way we should, most of us believe that we just wouldn't even never feel angry because anger comes from something, you know, off kilter inside of us. In fact, I did a group coaching session just this week, or it must have been last week, where the mom I was talking to, she's like, well, I feel angry, but I know I shouldn't feel angry. And then I was like, well, but you do feel angry. So tell me what you're angry about. And she's like, well, I feel angry, but I know that's just because I'm thinking about it in this wrong way. Okay, but you do feel angry, and it's like always, always we're coming back to, and yet you still feel angry. This is a true thing. It is how you feel. Maybe you think you shouldn't feel it. Maybe you think that there's a parallel universe where this could happen and you wouldn't feel angry. Maybe the you of the future wouldn't feel angry about it. But right now, in this moment, you do feel angry. That's just the fact. That's just true. Um, I mean, whether we like it or not, anger is a part of life. So instead of thinking about anger as this like sign of us being messed up, I really love this, I think, more evolved and realistic way of thinking about anger, which is that anger it's a force, it's an energy inside us that comes like instinctively. It is a physical impulse inside us. It's a huge charge almost of electricity, just like lightning. And once that electricity builds and builds and builds inside of you, it, just like lightning, needs to be directed at something and have a point of contact in order to discharge and free itself. Like lightning strikes, and there's nothing we can do about that. But we can choose where we project our anger. So if you think about anger as this like mounting energy inside of you that is directional, and it needs to be projected and connect with something in order to release. If you want anger to be something that just happens and then it moves on and it's not like this constant part of your life, we actually need to do something intentional with our anger. And the intentional thing that most of us are doing with our anger is stuff that does not work. It's either suppression or identification. So let's talk about what does that mean? So most of us either, and I would say we're doing both of these things at different times. Most of us are either suppressing our anger, which is basically telling ourselves it's not an option, denying it, repressing it, ignoring it, right? We have a rule. You're not allowed to be angry. So we deny ourselves that option of anger, and we wind up choosing other things instead because we're not allowed to be angry. So a lot of times, especially when I talk to Nia type ones, I'll be like, I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated. Or we choose being like hurt and wounded or super indecisive. Like, what am I going to do about this thing? I don't know. And I just am like building up this feeling of like almost like panic. And it's all really coming from this like suppressed anger. And the anger still gets expressed, right? But not in this like healthy way. We express anger passively, like by making these like cynical comments or being distant or being uncooperative or guilting other people or shutting down. These are passive ways of expressing anger, and they hurt people. They are very destructive, even though we might not be yelling or being super directly aggressive with somebody. And when we do that suppression or denial of our anger, we are in this like depressed, stuck state. And we're just trying to be harmless and easy for people, and it's not working. So that's that first way. The second way that most people use become quote unquote intentional about their anger is to allow themselves to just be out of control with their anger. They identify with their anger. They don't just feel angry, they are angry. We become blended or enmeshed with that feeling. We lose our actual true adult self because the anger takes us over and explodes out of us. And because there's not enough like self awareness during that explosion, we wind up being very destructive, lashing out, wanting to damage just to diffuse that tension. There's not awareness or control, and we definitely hurt other people. So, both of those ways of dealing with anger are really destructive and hurtful, and they're not helping us at all. Because in either of those scenarios, we do not consciously connect to our own anger. Instead, we're either denying it or identifying with it. And neither of those are good because we're not in our adult selves while we're behaving this way. So instead, I want to suggest to you that there's a whole nother way to look at anger. So if you adopt what I have said earlier, this idea of anger being this force that needs to be directed at something and discharged. Okay, well, how can we do that like thoughtfully, intentionally, consciously from self? How can we do that? And there is a really amazing practice that I have been working with my clients on, and I want to share a little bit of it here for you. It's personal and deep, so it's not something that I'm going to go fully into in a podcast episode. But really, it includes three steps: acknowledging anger, allowing anger, and working with anger, like actually directing that anger. And none of this, what I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to go into all the detail level of this, but I want you to know that all of these steps are internal emotional steps. Even in that step when we're directing anger, we are not outwardly doing anything to anybody. We are going into our minds and allowing that energy to flow where it needs to flow, to be directed towards somebody or something to release that energy. But it's all happening in your mind, in your psyche. Okay. And it might sound like this is crazy. Like, how could this even make a difference? You're not doing anything to fix the problem that's causing your anger, or even the person you're angry with might not even know that what they've done is hurtful to you or that you're experiencing this anger. It's all just like this imaginary process that you're going through. I totally get it if you're feeling that way. It does feel kind of like hokey or something like that. But I can promise you, my first time in guiding people through this process was at the fall retreat that I conducted back in October. And the women who were on that retreat and did this exercise had life changing experiences that they are still talking about today. And all we did was sit in the room and go internal and be angry. It was really remarkable. And since then, I have talked about this practice many times with my clients, and I've actually started to include it as part of their bonus materials in their coaching portal because it's an exercise that you don't need to do with a guide once you've done it. But really allow yourself permission to do those three steps, knowing that you're not hurting anybody. It doesn't mean anything bad about you that you have anger, and that if we don't actually acknowledge, accept, and then actually do like almost like do anger, if we don't do it, it will do us. And that is what's happening when we yell at our kids, when we lose our temper. Like that anger is taking us over instead of us taking control in an actual awake, self directed way from a place of self instead of from a place of I have to control myself and there's a rule. That's not actually being in control. That's being controlling. but it's not actually being in control. Because what's really happening is I'm so afraid of my own emotions that I have to put a lid on them. Give me a break. It's not working, right? But instead saying, like, I am going to actively engage with my anger productively. I am going to direct my anger at the thing that I'm angry at. I'm going to do this process that helps that anger release. That is completely different, even though it's just all in your mind. It's hard to imagine that doing this exercise in your mind could be more of a release and more powerful than that explosion that you might eventually have where you really let it all out. That leaves such a path of death and destruction in its wake versus doing this exercise that is about being in yourself while you feel your anger. So just imagine the difference between being like almost like unconscious and out of control when you either lose your temper or when you're just like a snarky, you know what, to the people around you because you're really irritated and angry. That's not consciousness. That's not self versus actually being super pissed, but awake and conscious the whole time, using that power, embracing that power instead of being taken over by it. We don't need to hurt others unconsciously, but instead we are dancing with our own shadow. And it's actually a growth practice. It's not just something you have to do so you can survive. It's a thing that you're doing because there's something to be learned and taught and gained and grown through by being present with what is actually going on inside of you. So think about those steps, that awareness, that acceptance, and then that action of being angry. And if this is feeling really powerful to you, if you are sitting there being like, okay, 2025 is my year, I'm going to be the most Zen mom on the planet. Being angry is probably the quickest way to being the Zen mom that you want to be, or a Zen dad, or whatever. And it really involves completely shifting your relationship with anger and breaking down all of the storytelling that we have around anger. And this is what I do with my clients. Most people come to me thinking, oh, this is great. I've got this XYZ problem with my kiddo or with my communication or with my relationship. And Anne's going to teach me the nuts and bolts, the actual skills that I need to parent better or show up better in this relationship. And you're 100% right. You are going to get that stuff from me for sure. But what usually surprises people is that in addition to all those arrows in your quiver that you get from me, we do stuff like this, which is like, let's get to the root of why you're showing up the way you're showing up right now, so that all those arrows in your quiver are going to fly straight and true when you decide to use them. And that is where the personal growth element of coaching comes in, and the personal growth element of parenting comes in. All of these moments that your kids create for you, they're like creating these little classrooms over and over and over again in which you get to learn these lessons that you're not done learning yet. And for so many of us, those lessons have to do with anger and our negative emotions. So set up that free discovery call. I can't imagine a better way to kick off the new year than to start with a really tuned in, insightful conversation with a professional who can empathize with you, completely know what you're going through, and give you some amazing clarity to walk into this new year with. And who knows, maybe even start a coaching journey with. Have a great week, everybody. I will talk to you again soon. Bye.
The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/KaplanCall, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.